When people choose a place to live, they usually focus on things like career opportunities, housing costs, or the overall atmosphere of the city. Then, before long, they find themselves spending months complaining about the weather. It's either unbearably hot, painfully cold, excessively humid, or enough to make them wonder why they moved there in the first place. But what if the biggest quality of life upgrade isn't a higher paycheck or a better neighborhood? What if it's simply finding the right climate? This isn't another generic countdown of pleasant places to live. Instead, it's a data-driven, reality-tested look at cities where the weather genuinely feels comfortable throughout the year, not just in statistics, but in everyday life. Here's something most people never hear. Some of the best weather cities rarely get any attention. They quietly outperform many of the famous destinations that dominate travel magazines and online rankings. In fact, one city on this list appears completely ordinary at first glance, until you look at the actual numbers. So, do you really know which cities have the best weather? There's only one way to find out. We're talking about places where winter doesn't punish you, summer doesn't exhaust you, and your mood isn't controlled by whatever forecast appears on your phone each morning. Number 10. Medford, Oregon. You probably shouldn't be as impressed by Medford as you end up being. But then you start looking at the climate data, and suddenly your expectations for what good weather means begin to change. Located in southern Oregon's Rogue Valley, Medford benefits from a climate that seems to avoid many of the extremes affecting other parts of the country. Summer temperatures regularly climb into the upper 80s and low 90s, but there's an important difference here. It's a dry heat. Instead of dealing with heavy, exhausting humidity, you get warm days that remain surprisingly manageable. Winter is equally forgiving, with average daytime highs typically reaching the upper 40s. Snowfall happens occasionally, but it's more of a temporary visitor than a permanent part of daily life. What makes Medford interesting is that it isn't trying to sell itself as some hidden paradise. It simply functions well. The cost of living remains roughly 5% to 10% below the national average. It's not incredibly cheap, but it also avoids the financial shock that comes with many California markets. Housing prices have been rising, with median home values sitting around the $400,000 range, but they're still within reach for many buyers. Rental costs for a comfortable apartment or home generally fall between $1,200 and $1,600 per month, making the city relatively affordable, at least for now. Crime statistics run slightly above the national average, although property crime accounts for most of that difference. It's less about major safety concerns and more about adopting simple habits, like remembering to lock your car doors. The local economy relies heavily on healthcare, retail, agriculture, and transportation industries. No, this isn't the next Silicon Valley, but it does offer a level of economic stability that many communities would envy. Of course, there's a catch, because there always is. During wildfire season, air quality can deteriorate significantly. That's the compromise you make. For much of the year, you enjoy remarkably comfortable weather, only to be reminded in late summer that nature still sets the rules. One resident summed it up perfectly. It's paradise right up until the sky turns orange and your lungs decide to file a formal complaint. Living in Medford can feel like you've discovered a hidden loophole. You're not constantly digging yourself out of snowstorms, and you're not spending months trapped in suffocating humidity. Instead, you're living in a place where the climate generally cooperates with you rather than fighting against you. At the same time, there's an underlying sense that this balance may not last forever. Number 9. Greenville, South Carolina. Greenville has a way of winning you over before revealing its catch. It introduces itself with gorgeous spring weather and comfortable temperatures. Then suddenly, summer arrives with all the subtlety of a plot twist you never saw coming. Situated near the foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains, Greenville enjoys what many people would consider an almost ideal climate for much of the year. Winters are generally mild, spring and fall stretch on for weeks, and there's enough sunshine to keep seasonal gloom at bay. Then summer humidity arrives, and everything changes. One minute you're living in a picture-perfect southern city, and the next you're wondering how the air itself became a physical object. And Greenville isn't some hidden secret anymore. This city is growing rapidly, and people across the country have started to notice. The cost of living remains approximately 8% to 12% below the national average, which still makes it attractive compared to many fast-growing metropolitan areas. Home prices typically range from about $320,000 to $380,000, although those numbers continue to climb as more residents relocate here every year. Rent prices generally fall between $1,300 and $1,700 monthly, depending largely on how close you want to be to Greenville's increasingly popular downtown district. The local economy is also expanding, with strong employment opportunities in manufacturing, healthcare, and technology-related industries. Major employers such as BMW, Michelin, and Prisma Health continue to drive much of the region's economic growth. Crime rates hover around the national average, with many suburban communities offering particularly safe environments, although some neighborhoods vary significantly. What many people fail to realize is that Greenville's greatest advantage isn't simply its weather, it's the timing of that weather. Spring and autumn last long enough to feel like someone intentionally removed the most unpleasant parts of the calendar. For months, the climate feels almost perfectly balanced. Then July arrives. Suddenly, the air becomes so heavy and humid that it feels almost tangible. Living in Greenville can sometimes resemble being in a relationship with someone who's absolutely wonderful for 8 months of the year and just a little overwhelming during the remaining 4. You'll fall in love with the walkable downtown, the vibrant atmosphere, and the fact that mountain scenery is only a short drive away. You may even find yourself asking, why doesn't everyone move here? Then August shows up, you step outside for 30 seconds, and you begin reconsidering every life choice you've ever made. Number 8. Prescott, Arizona. You know how people love to talk about how incredible Arizona weather is, and then you discover they live somewhere that regularly reaches 115 degrees? Well, Prescott is usually the part of the story they leave out. That's because this isn't Phoenix. This is Arizona at elevation, and that one difference changes almost everything. Prescott has built a reputation for being comfortable, scenic, and quietly exceptional. Surprisingly, that's one of the few places where the advertising actually matches reality. Located at roughly 5,300 feet above sea level, Prescott avoids many of the brutal temperature extremes that define much of the Southwest. Summer temperatures typically settle into the mid-80s, creating warm but manageable days. Winters are cooler, often dropping into the 30s, but severe cold is uncommon. The city even experiences occasional light snowfall, just enough to remind you that seasons exist, without forcing you to spend weeks digging out your driveway. In many ways, Prescott feels like Arizona with the volume turned down. It's as if someone finally adjusted the thermostat to a setting that actual human beings would choose. But there's something people don't always mention. The lifestyle here isn't designed for everyone. Let's talk numbers. The cost of living runs approximately 10% to 15% above the national average, which means the traditional "Arizona is cheap" narrative doesn't really apply in Prescott. Median home prices have climbed above the $500,000 mark, largely because more people are realizing that comfortable weather comes at a premium. Rental costs generally range from about $1,400 to $1,900 per month, depending on whether you prioritize downtown access or scenic views. Crime rates remain lower than the national average, giving the city a reputation for being safe, quiet, and predictable. The job market, however, is more limited. Healthcare, education, and tourism dominate the local economy. If you're looking for a fast-paced career hub or the next major tech center, Prescott probably isn't it. What many residents ultimately choose is a trade-off. Less opportunity in exchange for more stability, less chaos in exchange for more peace, and slower growth in exchange for breathing room. And surprisingly, many people find that trade worthwhile. Part of the reason is simple. The weather rarely works against you. It doesn't wear you down. It doesn't demand constant adaptation. Instead, it exists in a comfortable middle ground that many cities spend decades trying and failing to achieve. The funny thing is that Prescott represents the version of Arizona many people imagine before they actually move to Arizona. Phoenix is often the reality. Prescott feels more like the corrected edition. The updated version. The one where someone finally says, "No, this is what we actually meant." Number 7. Santa Rosa, California. Let's start with the uncomfortable reality about Santa Rosa. Up to this point on the list, this may very well offer the best overall weather, and it might also be one of the hardest places to justify financially. Located in California's Sonoma County wine region, Santa Rosa benefits from the kind of climate that people around the country imagine when they think of ideal weather. Summers usually settle into the low 80s, evenings cool down just enough to stay comfortable, and winters feel more like a gentle suggestion than an actual season. There are no crushing humidity levels, no prolonged freezes, and very little weather-related drama. It's simply balanced. And that balance comes with a price tag. Santa Rosa represents what happens when exceptional weather collides with extremely high demand. The cost of living sits roughly 40% to 60% above the national average, which is where the dream starts becoming expensive. Home prices commonly range from $700,000 to $800,000 or more, and that's without stretching into luxury territory. Renting isn't much easier either. Expect to pay somewhere between $2,000 and $2,800 per month for a reasonably comfortable place. And even then, the word cozy may be doing some heavy lifting. The local economy is supported by healthcare, tourism, the wine industry, and a growing population of remote workers connected to the Bay Area. Crime rates run slightly above the national average, though property crime accounts for most of that difference. It's generally less about danger and more about occasional opportunism. What many people don't realize is that Santa Rosa isn't simply expensive, it's selective. People rarely end up here by accident. Usually, they've either planned for years to make it work, or they're fortunate enough not to have to plan very much at all. Living in Santa Rosa can feel like you've discovered a hidden setting in the climate system. You wake up in the morning, step outside, and everything feels perfectly calibrated. It's not too hot, it's not too cold, the air isn't humid, but it's not overly dry either. It's the kind of weather that makes you forget weather is supposed to be a problem. Then the bills arrive. The rent payment arrives. The grocery bill arrives. The gas prices remind you where you live. And suddenly it becomes clear that you're essentially paying a premium subscription fee for year-round comfort. And yet, people stay. The reason is simple. Once you've lived with this kind of climate for long enough, almost everywhere else starts to feel like a compromise. Santa Rosa's unofficial slogan might as well be, "Yes, we perfected the weather. No, it wasn't going to be cheap." And somehow, most residents seem perfectly willing to accept that arrangement. Number 6. Boise, Idaho. Boise has an interesting twist when it comes to weather. It actually gives you all 4 seasons, but none of them feel like they're trying to punish you. That might not sound like a big deal until you've lived somewhere where summer is unbearable, winter is extreme, and every season feels like a test of endurance. In Boise, summers typically climb into the high 80s and occasionally reach the low 90s, but the dry air keeps things manageable rather than oppressive. Winters bring snow, yes, but not the kind that shuts down daily life for weeks at a time. Spring and fall quietly stand out as some of the best parts of the year, long, steady, and genuinely enjoyable instead of rushed or unpredictable. Boise doesn't aim to be flawless. Its real strength is simply avoiding misery, which turns out to be surprisingly rare. Over the past decade, the city has experienced steady growth, and like many once underrated places, its secret is no longer a secret. The cost of living now sits roughly 10% to 15% above the national average. It used to be significantly cheaper, but that phase has largely disappeared. Median home prices have climbed to around $500,000 or more, showing just how quickly demand has increased. In other words, Idaho has entered its own version of California pricing, just with more mountains in the background. Rent generally falls between $1,400 and $1,900 per month, depending on neighborhood choice and how much natural light you want in your life. Crime rates remain below the national average, making Boise feel safer than many similarly sized cities. The job market is also expanding, with growth in tech, healthcare, government work, and agriculture forming a relatively stable economic base. What most people don't realize is that Boise's biggest advantage isn't excitement, it's consistency. Life here doesn't swing between extremes. Instead, it follows a predictable rhythm. Stable seasons, stable routines, and a generally stable sense of comfort. That kind of reliability can be surprisingly valuable. Of course, growth comes with side effects. As more people move in, you start noticing small changes, slightly heavier traffic, rising home prices, and that subtle feeling that things used to be simpler not too long ago. Still, living in Boise often feels like choosing stability over chaos and actually getting exactly what you expected. You get real seasons without extreme suffering, access to nature without total isolation, and a city that feels active without being overwhelming. It doesn't try to constantly impress you, but that's part of the appeal. The only issue is that Boise isn't loud about its strengths. It doesn't feel like a place that's trying to win your attention every second. For some people, that's a drawback. For others, it's the entire reason to be there. Number 5. Asheville, North Carolina. Have you ever stepped outside and instantly thought, yeah, this is what weather is supposed to feel like? That's the kind of impression Asheville gives you, at least until it occasionally decides to add a bit of drama. Tucked into the Blue Ridge Mountains, Asheville manages something that feels almost curated. 4 distinct seasons that actually feel enjoyable instead of extreme. Summers usually stay comfortably in the 80s, winters are cool but rarely harsh, and fall is famously stunning. Spring feels like a kind of reward after colder months. The city doesn't try to be perfect, it just consistently comes close. Visually, Asheville looks like a postcard. In reality, it feels like a small city that's steadily under growing pressure. The cost of living sits roughly 10% to 15% above the national average. It's not extreme, but it's definitely trending upward. Median home prices typically range between $450,000 and $550,000, showing that those mountain views come at a real cost. Rent usually falls somewhere between $1,400 and $1,900, depending on neighborhood and proximity to the more desirable areas. The job market is built around tourism, healthcare, hospitality, and a steadily growing remote work population. In practical terms, that means flexibility, but not always high income potential. Crime rates sit slightly above the national average in certain areas, mostly driven by property crime. It's not chaotic, but it's not completely invisible either. What many people don't realize is that Asheville's greatest strength, its personality, is also what puts pressure on it. The city is artistic, unconventional, and deeply creative. That atmosphere attracts people from all over, and that popularity slowly reshapes everything around it. Living in Asheville often feels like choosing quality of life and atmosphere over pure financial optimization. And for many residents, that choice feels worth it. You get mountain air, walkable streets, and a city that feels alive without becoming overwhelming. But eventually, reality shows up in subtle ways. Wages don't always keep up with rising prices. Tourist seasons bring waves of crowds, and increasingly, it feels like you're paying extra just to live inside a certain feeling. Still, for a lot of people, that feeling is exactly the point. As one local put it, you don't move to Asheville to get rich. You move here so your mind can finally relax. Asheville is what happens when a city prioritizes personality over efficiency and somehow manages to keep it working. Number 4. San Luis Obispo, California. There's a reason people tend to talk about San Luis Obispo in a hushed tone, almost like it's a secret they're not supposed to give away. The truth is, this place doesn't just have good weather. It has almost suspiciously consistent weather. Temperatures usually hover between the mid-60s and mid-70s for most of the year. Summers rarely become extreme, and winters barely register as anything intense. Thanks to its coastal influence, everything stays balanced, steady, and unusually predictable. It's the kind of climate that makes you stop thinking about weather altogether, which is exactly where things get interesting. San Luis Obispo, often shortened to SLO if you want to sound like you know the place, isn't just desirable, it's also limited. The cost of living runs roughly 60% to 80% above the national average, which immediately places it in a very different category. Median home prices typically land somewhere between $800,000 and $900,000 or more. At that point, moving there stops being a casual decision and starts feeling like a financial strategy. Rent usually falls between $2,200 and $3,000 per month, depending on how close you want to be to downtown or the coastline. The job market is mostly driven by education, healthcare, tourism, and small businesses. It's relatively stable, but not known for high salaries across the board. Crime rates are lower than the national average, giving the area a calm, quiet, and almost controlled atmosphere. What most people don't immediately notice is that SLO doesn't feel expensive in day-to-day life. It feels easy, walkable, manageable, comfortable. But when you zoom out and look at the overall cost of living, you start to understand what that comfort is actually priced at. Living in San Luis Obispo feels like stepping into a version of California that actually followed through on its promise. You're not stuck in LA-level traffic, you're not dealing with freezing northern conditions, and you're not melting in inland heat. Instead, you're simply existing in a place where the weather supports your routine instead of disrupting it. Of course, the trade-offs are still there. They just show up quietly. There's a limited ceiling for high-paying jobs, the entry cost is steep, and many people end up staying not because it's easy to leave, but because it's difficult to recreate this kind of environment elsewhere for less money. One local summed it up perfectly. Living here feels like you're on a permanent vacation until the bills show up. San Luis Obispo is what happens when a city solves the weather problem completely and then quietly adds an entry fee. Number 3. Albuquerque, New Mexico. Albuquerque is one of those places that gets over 300 days of sunshine a year, but unlike many sunny cities, it doesn't force you to suffer for it. Located in the high desert at around 5,000 feet of elevation, it creates a unique balance. The sun feels strong, but the air stays noticeably cooler than you'd expect. Winters are present but never overbearing, and they don't linger longer than necessary. Humidity is almost non-existent. The result is a climate that feels like it's working with you rather than constantly testing your limits. Yet for some reason, it remains underrated. Albuquerque isn't a flashy city. It doesn't market itself aggressively, but when you look at the actual numbers, it holds up surprisingly well. The cost of living sits roughly 5% to 10% below the national average, which immediately gives it an advantage compared to many other cities on this list. Median home prices typically range between $320,000 and $380,000, which feels almost unusually affordable after the previous entries. Rent is also relatively manageable, usually falling between $1,100 and $1,500 per month, making it one of the more accessible options for everyday living without extreme financial pressure. The job market is steady rather than explosive, with employment centered around healthcare, government, education, and a gradually growing tech presence. It's not a high-speed economic boomtown, but it offers stability. Crime rates, however, sit above the national average, which represents one of the city's real trade-offs. What many people don't realize is that Albuquerque is a city built on contrasts. You get stunning sunsets, wide-open skies, affordable housing, and some of the most comfortable dry-weather living conditions in the country. At the same time, there are areas dealing with higher crime rates, uneven development, and a reputation that often discourages people before they ever visit. Living here feels like discovering value where most people didn't bother to look. You gain space, sunlight, and a climate that doesn't drain you physically or mentally. But in return, you stay aware. You choose neighborhoods carefully. You learn how the city works instead of assuming it will simply take care of you. And interestingly, that balance works for many residents. Some cities feel safe but restrictive. Others feel open but require vigilance. Albuquerque leans toward openness while asking you to stay intelligent and attentive. It's almost as if the city itself says, "Here's incredible weather, affordable living, and stunning scenery, but you're going to have to pay attention." Number 2. Eugene. Oregon Albuquerque doesn't try to present itself as perfect. It simply offers something most cities struggle to provide: comfort without constant financial strain. And that combination, as it turns out, can be surprisingly powerful. Coming in at number 2 is Eugene. At first, you might think you dislike rain. But Eugene has a way of changing that perception. This isn't the kind of rain that storms, floods, or forces you to cancel your plans. Instead, it's soft, steady, and always in the background, more like atmospheric texture than severe weather. When you combine that with mild temperatures throughout the year, the result is a climate that feels oddly addictive. Nothing ever pushes too far in one direction. Eugene doesn't win because of sunshine or dramatic weather. It wins through balance and moderation. The cost of living sits roughly 10% to 15% above the national average. It isn't the cheapest place, but it also doesn't reach the extremes of major coastal California markets. Median home prices typically range between $450,000 and $520,000. And while that number continues to rise, it's still relatively attainable compared to larger West Coast cities. Rent generally falls between $1,400 and $1,900 per month, reflecting its identity as a college town with steady, ongoing demand. The job market is anchored by education, especially the University of Oregon, along with healthcare and a growing remote work population. Crime rates are slightly above the national average, mostly driven by property-related incidents. What most people don't realize is that Eugene's real strength isn't what it adds to your life. It's what it removes. There are no extreme heat waves, no severe cold snaps, and no constant anxiety about dramatic weather shifts. In that sense, life feels calmer and more predictable. But there is a trade-off. Long stretches of gray skies. For some people, that overcast atmosphere feels cozy. For others, it slowly becomes mentally heavy. Living in Eugene feels like stepping into a slower emotional rhythm. You're not rushing from one thing to another, and you're not constantly reacting to environmental extremes. Instead, you exist in a place that keeps your stress levels relatively steady. But after enough time, the grayness can build up. Days begin to blend together, and the challenge becomes less about physical comfort and more about mental balance. One local put it simply, "It's beautiful here, but you need hobbies that keep you indoors." Eugene almost feels like it removed extreme weather in exchange for something else, emotional weather. Fun fact, the city averages 150 or more rainy days per year. Not intense storms, just persistent drizzle. The kind of rain people try to downplay as mist, even though it absolutely counts. You leave the house dry and somehow return slightly damp, as if the atmosphere made a quiet decision to inconvenience you. Number 1. Ventura, California. Let's be honest. When people picture perfect weather, they're usually imagining something very close to Ventura. It's coastal Southern California, but without the nonstop chaos and intensity of Los Angeles. Temperatures typically stay in the high 60s to mid-70s for most of the year. Summers rarely get too hot, winters barely feel like winters at all, and the ocean breeze handles the rest. There are no extremes, no dramatic swings, and no recovery periods needed afterward. Just steady, consistent comfort. That consistency is exactly why Ventura takes the top spot. It's often described as the quieter, more grounded version of Southern California, and in this case, that reputation is actually accurate. The cost of living sits roughly 50% to 70% above the national average. You're still paying California prices, just slightly less intense than Los Angeles. Median home values typically fall between $750,000 and $850,000 or more, because coastal access never comes cheap. Rent usually ranges from about $2,200 to $3,000 per month. And yes, the ocean breeze is included, but financial relief is not. The job market is supported by healthcare, education, tourism, and commuters who work in or near Los Angeles. Crime rates hover around the national average, generally safer than larger Southern California cities, but not entirely absent. What many people don't realize is that Ventura isn't trying to impress anyone. It simply delivers one of the most stable, livable climates in the country without turning itself into a high-energy spectacle. Living here feels like removing one of the biggest daily stressors in life: the weather. You don't organize your day around heat waves. You don't brace for freezing winters. You don't constantly check the forecast like it's a warning system. You just live. But that comfort quietly comes with a cost that's always present in the background. One local summed it up perfectly. You stop checking the weather and start checking your bank account instead. Ventura didn't earn its top spot by being flashy. It earned it by removing friction from everyday life. And in many ways, that's more powerful than perfection. There's also a funny side to it. In Ventura, people will genuinely complain when temperatures dip below 60 degrees. 60 degrees. In most places, that's hoodie weather. Here, it's treated like a minor inconvenience. It's chilly today, someone might say. And elsewhere you'd think, no, it's not. You've just forgotten what real cold feels like. Mornings often begin with windows open and ocean air drifting through the room like it belongs there. The sun rises gently instead of aggressively. You step outside without a jacket debate or second guessing. The day warms slightly, then cools slightly, and nothing ever really spikes.